I saw this article on jw.org. Whom can you trust? What does the Bible say? And I just wanted to make a quick video to break down what they're saying here because this article is very deceptive. So it starts off by saying that people are disappointed when those who are supposed to be trustworthy let them down. Many have lost trust in political leaders who put their own interests ahead of the needs of people. And I agree with that because politics is an absolute deception, and I've made a whole video about that as well. So moving on, it says media outlets that fail to report the news fairly and accurately. Well, we can go back to the year 2020 where there was a lot of false reports in the news about what's going to happen or what will happen if you don't do XYZ. And of course, Watchtower was on that bandwagon, flowing down that information to its followers. And it got them, many of them, to do a certain thing that they probably originally did not want to do. So if you can't trust the media outlets, how can you trust Watchtower, who basically copied and pasted what the media outlets were doing as well? The next bullet point says scientists who do not act in the public's best interest. Well, everything that comes from scientists is faith-based because the average person doesn't have access to the work that scientists do and publish. They basically have to take their word for it. And so does Watchtower. So are they saying that if you don't trust scientists, you don't trust them as well? Because that's an interesting point of view. The next bullet point says religious leaders who are deeply involved in supporting politics rather than in representing God. But if you look at the history of Watchtower, you see them very much so intertwined in politics. Not of late, but definitely back in the Rutherford days, him rubbing shoulders with people like Hitler, as well as other prominent figures in the United States. So they don't get away from that bullet point as well. So they go on to say that people are right to be cautious about whom they trust. And that's interesting because if you don't trust the governing body, you do not have a right to be cautious about that. According to Watchtower, if you cannot and do not trust the governing body, their leaders, well, you can find yourself disfellowshipped and shunned for that. The next bullet point says, don't put your trust in human leaders. No human being can save you. It's funny that they say that because if you do not trust in their human leaders, again, you can be disfellowshipped or disassociated and then shunned by your friends and family. So does this apply to them? Are you allowed to not trust their organization leaders? Interesting. But the punchline of this little article here, it says, the Bible identifies someone you can trust, Jesus Christ. He was not just a good man who lived many centuries ago. God appointed Jesus to rule as king, and there will be no end to his kingdom. Jesus is king of God's kingdom, a government now ruling from heaven. So this article was probably designed for someone who's not familiar with the religion, who was pointed to jw.org so that they can find out more about the religion and how they can join. But if they read this paragraph, they're thinking that Jesus is king and therefore he's the king of this religion. But what they don't know and what the article is not saying is that you have to go through their governing body to get to Jesus, because as they've pointed out in their literature, Christ is not the mediator for the Jehovah's Witnesses. He's just the mediator for the governing body. So someone who's reading this article, they have no clue that the governing body will stand between them and Christ and then Jehovah. So this article is very deceptive. And then they go on to say, to learn why you can trust Jesus, read the articles. And I've looked at both of these articles, and none of them, of course, mentions the governing body. So if someone goes through and clicks the button to try out their Bible course, they're going to go through multiple study points before they get to the point about the Jehovah's Witnesses having a governing body. So this entire article is just propaganda. It's basically fluff to get the prospective Bible student to join, to start Bible studies, and then get them hooked on what they're learning. And then eventually they'll find out more about the governing body and how they need to have complete trust in them. So a very deceptive article. And most of these articles that appear on the front page of jw.org, they're basically fluff pieces or propaganda pieces that will hook the reader. And then by the time they're in too deep in their Bible study, when they find out about the governing body, it's too late. They're in too deep. And if they're smart enough, they'll wake up and say, we shouldn't be worshiping men, or I don't know who these men are. I came here because I wanted to learn more about Christ and Jehovah, for instance. But by then they're so love bombed and manipulated that they probably start to believe that this is the truth, to the point where they basically just accept that these men should be ruling over them and that they're the chosen ones according to the scripture in Matthew that the witnesses use. And then they continue to study and get baptized, and before you know it, they're a full-fledged Jehovah's Witness due to indoctrination. So these little articles, they might not work on everyone, but they're probably effective, and it's probably a good way to start hooking unsuspected people into starting Bible courses. So it's very deceptive from the top to bottom, again, because a lot of these bullet points, the Watchtower organization isn't free from these accusations. A lot of these bullet points actually talks about the Watchtower organization, but the average witness wouldn't think about it like that. And then, of course, they try to focus on Jesus, whereas they're actually going to be obeying the governing body as their rulers. So if these articles would come right out and say or speak about the governing body, it would turn most of these people off. But they're very clever in the way they set these little mini articles up, because they get the unsuspecting Bible students hooked on this, and then before you know it, they're knee deep into a cult. So who can you trust? Well, trust yourself, trust your instincts, and stop trusting men and organizations you know nothing about.
Since Jehovah God and Jesus Christ completely trust the faithful and discreet slave, should we not do the same?